Seth Williams had always believed in hard work, integrity, and loyalty. For the past 5 years, he had poured everything he had into their business, a small but growing marketing firm they had started together, with Emma by his side. At first, it was all about dreams, late-night brainstorming sessions, ambitious plans, and the adrenaline rush of bringing their ideas to life. She was his partner in every sense of the word. They shared everything, their goals, their successes, their failures. He trusted her with every part of himself. Their business was thriving. They had clients now, big ones, some had even called them the next big thing. Seth couldn't have been prouder of what they'd accomplished. He remembered the early days, when everything was uncertain. The constant hustle, the long hours, the sleepless nights. Emma had always been there, pushing him, supporting him. They made a great team. But lately, something felt off. Seth couldn't put his finger on it, but the energy between him and Emma had started to shift. She was still present in the office, still putting in the hours, but there was an emotional distance he couldn't ignore. He began to notice small things, her late nights at the office, the way she avoided his gaze when they had meetings, her increasing interest in the company's finances. At first, he thought it was just stress, they both were under a lot of pressure, after all. But deep down, Seth had a feeling there was more to it. One night, after a long day of back-to-back meetings, Seth came home late, his mind buzzing with thoughts about the future of the business. He had just walked through the door when he heard voices coming from the study. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear Emma's voice, but there was someone else's too, a voice he didn't recognize. He stopped in his tracks. "Are you sure this is the right move?" the unfamiliar voice asked. "I'm sure," Emma replied, her voice calm but firm. "Once we have full control of the business, we'll have everything we need." Seth's too trusting, he'll never see it coming. The words hit Seth like a physical blow. What? He didn't understand. Full control? What was Emma talking about? He slowly stepped closer to the door, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. "Are you sure you can handle him?" the voice asked again. Emma laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "I've been handling Seth for years. Trust me, it'll be fine." Seth stood frozen in the doorway, his heart racing. He had no idea what was going on, but everything in him screamed that something was wrong, something big. He couldn't believe it. Emma? The woman he had built his life and business with, the woman he had trusted more than anyone, was talking about taking control of everything they had worked for. In that moment, everything he thought he knew about their partnership, about their love, crumbled. Seth couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. For weeks, it was like he was trying to ignore a faint, persistent hum in the background of his life. It wasn't the usual noise of running a business, the emails, the meetings, the constant phone calls. No, this was something deeper, a sensation of unease that clawed at him, just out of reach, but always there. At first, he had attributed it to stress. The business was growing fast. They were getting bigger clients, more press, and with that came the growing pressure to keep up, to keep pushing forward. But as time went on, the feeling gnawed at him with increasing intensity. Emma had always been the one who kept things running smoothly. She was the strategic thinker, the one with the long-term vision. She had always been the one he relied on for decisions, the one he trusted implicitly. But recently, Seth had noticed subtle shifts. She was spending more and more time away from him, late meetings, secretive phone calls, and the way her gaze sometimes lingered on the company's financial reports. Seth had always been hands-on with the business, but his focus was shifting to the creative side, leaving the numbers and day-to-day operations largely to Emma. He trusted her with that responsibility, but it was starting to feel like a mistake. He felt like she was pulling away from him, both personally and professionally. One morning, after a particularly stressful night working late, Seth arrived at the office to find Emma already there. It was a little past 7 a.m. She was sitting at her desk, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating her face, her fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard. She looked up as he entered, offering him a tight smile. "Morning," she said, but her eyes didn't meet his. She was distracted, focused entirely on whatever was on her screen. "Morning," Seth replied, but his voice lacked its usual warmth. He noticed the way she was avoiding eye contact, the tension in her posture. She had always been warm and engaging with him, but now, there was an unmistakable distance between them. "Everything okay?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light. Emma glanced up, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, quickly masked by her usual calm demeanor. "Yeah, just catching up on some emails," she said, brushing off his concern. Seth nodded, but the feeling of unease in his chest intensified. He watched her for a moment, noting the way she seemed more focused on her screen than on him. She used to be the one who asked how his night had been, who made him a cup of coffee when he was tired. But now, all of that felt like a distant memory. After a few minutes, Seth made his way to his office, trying to focus on the tasks in front of him, but his mind kept wandering back to Emma. Something wasn't right. And the more he tried to push the thoughts away, the stronger they became. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The feeling that she was keeping something from him, something important, had become unbearable. So, over the next few days, he began to quietly observe her. He paid closer attention to her behavior, to her interactions with the other employees, and especially to her time in the office. He even started keeping track of the hours she worked late, trying to piece together a pattern. And then, one day, Seth decided to take a step that would change everything. He had been sitting in his office late in the afternoon, poring over a set of client contracts when he heard the sound of voices coming from the conference room. At first, he thought nothing of it, just another meeting. But then he heard Emma's voice. She was speaking in low, measured tones, too soft for him to catch all the words. But one phrase stood out. "I need this to go smoothly. Once I have control, we can do whatever we want." Seth won't even know what hit him. The blood drained from Seth's face. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His breath caught in his throat, and his heart began to pound in his chest. Control? What was Emma talking about? He thought he was hearing things, but the more he listened, the more everything started to make sense in a horrible way. "Are you sure you can trust him?" a male voice asked, one that Seth didn't recognize. "I can handle him," Emma said coldly, her voice firm. "I've been handling him for years. He'll never see it coming." Seth's stomach churned. He couldn't breathe. This was it. This was what had been bothering him all along. He didn't know what exactly Emma had been planning, but it was clear now, she had been plotting behind his back. She was going to take the business from him. Everything they had built together, everything he had trusted her with, was a lie. His heart raced as he silently stood from his chair, his legs trembling beneath him. He needed to get out of there, to process this, to figure out what the hell was going on. But the walls of the office felt like they were closing in on him. His mind was reeling, and he could barely think straight. He waited until the voices in the conference room faded before quietly slipping out of his office, his body moving on autopilot as he made his way to the elevator. He couldn't face her right now. Not yet. He needed answers, but he wasn't ready to confront her without knowing what was really going on. As he rode down in the elevator, the weight of the realization hit him fully. Emma, the woman he had trusted more than anyone, had been planning to betray him. He thought back to the little things, the late nights, the secretive meetings, her increasing interest in the company's finances. All of it now seemed so obvious. And all of it led to one painful conclusion: Emma had never been on his side. She had been using him, manipulating him, and now, she was going to take everything from him. By the time the elevator doors opened to the ground floor, Seth had made up his mind. He couldn't confront her yet, not without more evidence. But he would get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. He had to protect what was his, their business, his future, before it was too late. The days following Seth's discovery were a blur of tension and confusion. Every time he saw Emma at the office, every time they exchanged even the most casual of words, his mind raced. He couldn't stop thinking about what he had overheard. The betrayal cut deep, but the worst part was the feeling of powerlessness. How could someone he had trusted so completely turn against him so coldly? And worse, how could she justify it to herself? Seth knew he couldn't let things drag on any longer. The suspicion, the anger, the disbelief, it was eating away at him. He had to confront Emma. He had to hear it from her own lips. But every time he considered what he might say, a wave of uncertainty washed over him. What if he was wrong? What if he had misunderstood? But deep down, he knew he hadn't. The way she had spoken, the way she had planned it all, made everything crystal clear. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, Emma had been playing him for months. The problem was that Seth wasn't ready for what he was about to hear. The confrontation was inevitable, but it was never going to be easy. It was a quiet Wednesday when Seth finally decided to confront her. The office was unusually empty. Most of the team had left early, giving Seth the opportunity to speak with Emma without distractions. He stood outside her office for a long moment, his hand hovering over the door handle. His palms were clammy, his heart hammering in his chest. He was about to have a conversation that would change everything. With a deep breath, he entered. Emma was sitting at her desk, staring at her laptop screen. She looked up when she heard the door open, her eyes briefly flickering with surprise. But then she regained her composure, her smile returning. "Seth, hey," she said, her voice smooth, almost too calm. "What's up?" Seth closed the door behind him, standing just inside the room. He looked at her for a long time, his eyes scanning her face as if trying to read her. Everything about her seemed off, from her overly relaxed demeanor to the tension in her eyes. She was pretending that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Seth had learned the hard way that when someone acts like everything is fine, it's usually because they're hiding something. "Emma," he said, his voice low and controlled. "We need to talk." Her expression faltered for just a second, but she quickly recovered, folding her arms across her chest in a defensive gesture. "Okay," she said, her voice still even. "What about?" "About the company," Seth replied, his voice tightening. "About everything." Emma's eyes narrowed, just slightly, but it was enough for Seth to catch the shift. "What do you mean?" "Everything's fine, Seth." "What's going on?" Seth took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to do this right. No more games. He walked closer to her desk, staring her down. "I know what you've been planning," he said, his voice sharp. "I heard everything." Emma stiffened. For a moment, her face turned pale, and Seth could see the mask of calm that she had been wearing begin to slip. But she quickly recovered, her lips curling into a cold smile. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You don't know what I'm talking about?" Seth asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "You've been planning to take over the company. You've been working with someone else behind my back, Emma. And you've been using me this whole time." For a moment, Emma didn't say anything. Her eyes flickered with something. Was it guilt? Regret? No, it was something far colder. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs and folding her arms tighter around her chest, almost as if she were trying to protect herself from the truth of what Seth had just said. "You're wrong," she finally said, her voice tight but laced with annoyance. "You really don't understand, do you, Seth? This was never about you. This was about what we were building, and you were just a means to an end." Seth's chest tightened. He hadn't expected her to admit it so quickly. He had prepared himself for denial, for her to act like everything was a misunderstanding. But this? This was far worse than he imagined. It was cold, calculated, and utterly devoid of remorse. What the hell does that mean? Seth asked, his voice rising in anger. We built this together. Everything we have, I trusted you. I loved you. And now you're telling me that it was all just for your benefit? Emma stood up slowly, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she walked around her desk. She came to stand directly in front of him, her eyes locking with his. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts in her gaze. She was in control, and she knew it. Let's be honest, Seth, she said, her voice low but cutting. You were too busy chasing your little dreams, always thinking with your heart instead of your head. I was the one keeping this business running. I was the one making the tough decisions. You never really got it, did you? Seth flinched. The words hit harder than he expected. For years, he had worked alongside her, trusting her, believing in her, and now she was telling him that he had been nothing but a fool? That all the work, the sacrifice, the late nights they had shared, meant nothing to her? He shook his head, his fists clenched at his sides. You think you're smarter than me? That I'm just some idiot who can't see what's happening? I don't think, Seth, Emma replied coldly. I know. Seth stepped back, trying to steady his breath. His mind was a whirlwind. This wasn't the woman he had known. This wasn't the person who had stood by his side through thick and thin. This was someone else entirely, someone with no loyalty, no integrity. Someone who was willing to destroy everything just to get ahead. So this is it, huh? Seth said, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and hurt. You've been plotting this for months? For all this time, I thought we were partners. But you've been working behind my back the entire time. And now you want control of everything we've built? Emma's eyes flashed, and for a moment, Seth saw something flicker behind her calm exterior, something like fear. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by her usual coldness. It's not personal, Seth. It's just business. You're weak. You never understood what needed to be done. So, yes, I'm taking control. I'm the one who's been carrying this company. And I'll be the one who takes it to the top. Seth's hands trembled, but he knew one thing for sure now, he couldn't let her win. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about standing up for himself. This was about reclaiming what was his. I'm done with you, Seth said, his voice hardening. I'll take back everything you've taken from me. You won't get away with this. Emma tilted her head, almost as if she were pitying him. You think you can take everything back? It's too late, Seth. You're already out of the game. I'll fight you, Seth said, his jaw clenched. And I will win. The following weeks were a blur of legal meetings, heated arguments, and painful decisions. Seth had to act fast to protect the business he had built. He hired a lawyer, worked tirelessly to regain control of the company, and severed all ties with Emma. She fought back with everything she had. She tried to claim that she was entitled to the company, that her role in it was invaluable. But Seth had the proof, the contract, the emails, the meetings. It was over. She had underestimated him. He was no longer the man she could manipulate. Finally, the day came when the last of the legal battles were resolved. Seth stood in the empty office, the place that had once been filled with ideas, laughter, and dreams. Now, it felt cold, sterile. Emma had lost. The company was his again, but it felt like a hollow victory. Seth had to rebuild. He had to reassemble the pieces of his life and career. But in a way, it was liberating. He had been broken, deceived, but he had also been freed. He no longer had to live in the shadow of Emma's manipulation. He could make his own decisions, choose his own path. Through it all, Seth learned a hard lesson: loyalty and trust are not things to be taken for granted. He had put his faith in the wrong person, but in the end, he found the strength to rise above the betrayal. As he stood in front of the new team he had built, he knew that he had rebuilt not just the business, but himself.